Across the globe, justice systems are being reimagined through trauma-informed care, desistance theory, and neuroscience. At the forefront of this movement stands a voice for change, a trainer of professionals, and a storyteller committed to evidence-based reform. This is The Criminologist, the podcast exploring the people, the practices, and the possibilities shaping a more humane justice system. And now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 234 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This episode's discussion is deeply sobering, but vitally necessary. We are staying close to home, peering into one of the most harrowing forms of criminal behavior, intra-familial homicide, when violence erupts among those who should be the closest to us. Could we be safer in public than in our own homes? Tragically, for some at least, the data suggest yes. From intimate partner murder to the devastating scenarios of filicide, parricide, fratricide, and even what's known as family annihilation. Family homicides continue to shock and perplex us. The language around these crimes matters. Terms like neonaticide, matricide, and uxoricide may sound clinical, but they offer us clarity, a path to understanding the complex motivations behind each of these tragedies. Enter today's guest, Dr. Jerrod Brown, founder of the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies, an enduring voice on forensic psychology, neuroscience, and social resilience. Dr. Brown is no stranger to our audience. He's appeared in episodes covering a variety of topics, from false confessions, the BTK case, social support, nutrition, and so much more. Most recently, his insights were featured in People Magazine's A Killer in the Family special edition, as he told them, quote, "People are fascinated by complex and deviant behavior. They want to understand the why behind these cases." And that's exactly why this episode matters. During my conversation with Jerrod, we will navigate with care through the typologies, the risk factors, and the social context behind intra-familial homicide. And we'll ask how we, as practitioners, policymakers, and public servants, can contribute to preventing and healing. Let's begin. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown, and I'll see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the show, Jerrod. I always look forward to these conversations because you are such a wealth of information on not just a variety of topics, but a variety of topics which I personally find very intriguing, and I'm confident our listeners do as well. And you're not going to disappoint today as we broach the topic of familial homicide. So I'm going to let you kick things off with a brief introduction. You're no stranger to the show, Jerrod, but in the event that we have some first-time listeners and or listeners who have not caught any of your compelling episodes in the past, introduce yourself, a brief background, and then let's talk about this topic of family homicide.
Joe, thanks for having me back, my friend, and congratulations to you, all the great work you're doing. So, well, folks, hope all of you are doing well. And my name's Jerrod, and I wear a couple different hats. I'm a professor. I do quite a bit of trainings for different groups around the country and do a lot of publishing and research and quite a bit of consulting as well. And where I do most of my work now is within the realm of like forensic neuroscience, neurocriminology, and I'm actually wrapping up another degree right now this summer if everything goes as planned in nutrition. So I'm trying to infuse the criminology, the forensic, the neuroscience research and combine it with the world of medicine and nutrition and the gut and inflammation and circadian rhythms and sleep. And the question comes up, like if you're a probation officer listening to this or a police officer, why in the world would you want to care about digestive health issues or circadian rhythm misalignment or what that person is eating? Well, if you dig into the literature, it is very clear why you need to understand this, because it impacts everything: your client's energy, their mood, their attention, their behavior. If you're running a COG skills group and your client skipped breakfast that morning and only had energy drinks and smoking cigarettes, their brain's not firing on all cylinders. If you're a police officer doing an interview of a sleep-deprived individual, there's plenty of literature to say that could be a risk factor for false confessions. If you're a forensic evaluator in the courts, I mean, the list goes on. So really taking a holistic, integrative, biopsychosocial approach to the work I do has really given me more of a holistic mindset. Joe, I know you are an expert in the R&R model. We've talked about, obviously the R&R model is fantastic, but if you can combine the R&R model with like neurobiological factors, neurocriminology, and those kind of things, and combine the two, it gives a more well-rounded, holistic picture of your client. And again, if you're stuck and you're in the criminal justice system and you're feeling frustrated, I have these same clients on my caseload year after year. Why can't they stop doing what they're doing? Why can't they, after being in treatment so many times, turn the corner and stop violating and getting into trouble? Well, have we ever thought about, could it be partially due to what they eat, how they sleep, what's going on with the gut, on top of environmental factors, social factors, family, vocational, all of those things that are very important. So that's kind of where I take my work. And what we're talking about today, obviously, is going to be a very dark topic on family homicide, domestic homicide, intra-familial homicide. I've done quite a bit of work in this area in terms of writing articles and doing trainings for different groups on these topics. And this is a topic that unfortunately is alive and well. I'm sure most of you listening to this probably have worked with a client impacted by domestic violence. Hopefully not too many of you have worked with an actual family homicide offender, but if you have, this is going to be very important for you to be aware of this. So,
Jen, I love listening as you speak because you and I are kindred spirits in so many ways. But as you were talking about, for example, why would a police officer want to know about nutrition, or a probation officer, or anyone in human services who is telling themselves, I'm going by the playbook here, whether it's the risk need responsivity playbook, why am I not getting the results I need? I just love the approach you take. And one of my favorite terms I always use is we need to take more of a holistic view of those that we supervise and that we serve. And yes, we've got a great foundation now with the risk needs responsivity framework, those principles of effective intervention that Bonton Andrews laid out in the psychology of criminal conduct. But yeah, I think now the field has evolved to the point of let's broaden that aperture. Let's bring in some more things, as you have done, Jerrod. I would contend my partner, Nicole Kimberly Staley, and I have done that with our TIDES model, where we're looking at some of these other variables around trauma, around neuroscience, and not just those pathways into crime, the risk needs responsivity framework, but those pathways out of crime and delinquency, the desistance framework. But again, it's all about getting a bigger picture of the client. It's almost as if we've tasked professionals with solving a puzzle, but we're not giving them all the pieces of the puzzle. And that's why I love having you on the show, Jerrod, because Among other things, you do an eloquent job of sort of connecting the dots or answering, as you just did, the question of, well, why would I care about that? Why in the world would I care about how much sleep my client got before I do a risk assessment interview, for example, or their nutrition or these other things that we just didn't consider in the past? So I appreciate that, Jerrod.
Thank you, Joe. Always appreciate your commentary too, and very helpful. And can we apply these things to domestic violence, family homicide, intervention, prevention? I sure hope so. I think we should. But as we get into this topic, again, dark topic, first, let's just briefly start out with family violence, domestic violence. We all know what that is. We all probably know somebody who's been in a relationship where there's been violent behavior in there, or coercive control. That's a topic you absolutely need to be aware of when we're talking about these things. Or maybe you have a loved one in a very controlling relationship. Or maybe there's no physical violence, but that loved one of yours is in a relationship where there's a lot of threats being made. For example, if you leave me, I'm going to take the kids. If you leave me, I'm going to call your work and tell them all kinds of bad things about you to get you fired. That's all domestic violence. What I do want to preface, the overwhelming majority of domestic violence perpetrators don't go on to commit domestic homicide. But the overwhelming majority, not all, domestic homicide cases, if you look in their history, there's going to be instances of various forms of family violence. So the research says when we think about like intra-familial homicide, that's a whole spectrum, and we'll talk about the whole spectrum today. But most of us, you see in the news every so often, there's an intimate partner homicide. When that happens, the research indicates, if you peel back the layers here, what was going on in the history of that relationship. Coercive control, that is definitely at the top of the list you want to be aware of. Threats of suicide are talked about. Murder-suicide cases, we'll talk about that a little bit today as well. Making threats, not just to the person directly, but the use of digital media. So threatening to get into their Facebook or threatening to post something online that's maybe true, maybe not. Sexual coercion. Strangulation is a huge risk factor for domestic homicide. So if that person is in a relationship and there is domestic violence strangulation going on, the research says that is a significant risk factor. Having access to a weapon. So if that perpetrator who's committing domestic violence is also strangulating, trying to strangle the victim, and there's access to weapons in that house, these are recipes that can lead to intimate partner homicide in some cases. When we think about whatever term you want to call it, intrafamilial homicide, domestic homicide, family homicide, without a doubt, it's a public health issue. It's a clinical issue. So if you're working in clinical mental health or in medical settings, you play a role in identifying red flag indicators. It's a forensic, it's a legal issue, it's an economic issue, it's a social problem. The list goes on and on and on. I believe Joe's going to send a link or share a link with all of you. Short little article I wrote a few years ago on the different terms that fall under the umbrella of intrafamilial homicide. I'll just give you a snapshot overview of what those are right now. And this is not an all-encompassing list, but some of the ones you want to be aware of. Topic of matricide. That's the killing of one's mother. Patricide. Murdering one's father. Parricide, the killing of one parent. Filicide, the killing of a child, and then you can break that down into infanticide and other kinds of variables. There's soricide, the killing of a sister. Fratricide, the killing of a brother. And there's many, many more. So basically, the key takeaway point here is there's many dimensions to this. What we're going to focus on today is mainly going to be on familicide and family annihilator cases. There's a lot of overlap with these subtypologies, but there's a lot of difference too, especially like maybe you are aware of a case where a mother murdered her newborn. Totally different dynamics. We might be having postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, totally different ballgame. We can definitely go into that in a future episode if Joe lowers his standards and allows me back. So, Joe, any thoughts with anything before I move into some maybe relationship level risk factors that maybe you could consider in conjunction with the R&R model and some other things?
I'm looking forward to you going down some of these rabbit holes. I've got the article you referenced in front of me here. And yes, I will include that in the show description for this episode for the listeners to follow along. But as you said, this is a fascinating topic. So I don't want to get in your way, Jerrod. Go ahead, and I'm going to look for those connections, as you said, to either the risk need responsivity model and or, as I like to do, put myself in the position of the practitioner and maybe approach it what's the value added for me of understanding these dynamics, even though, as you said, I may be supervising a domestic violence caseload and I'm not dealing with the issue of family homicide, but just informing that listener of sort of the connecting of the dots, if you will, laying a foundation. So, like I said, Jerrod, I'm going to be quiet and get out of your way. And yeah, let's start exploring some of these typologies.
Thank you, my friend. So if we look at intimate partner homicide, that's going to be, in most cases, the male partner murdering the female partner. Of course, there's always exceptions there. There's some articles and studies that talk about females murdering male partners, different dynamics. What we're going to talk about today is mainly going to be the male perpetrator, the female survivor in some cases, or victim. So if we look at intimate partner homicide and you peel back the layer, big puzzle, every case is different, but if you look at what the research says in a nutshell, the biggest individual and relationship level risk factors you'd want to be aware of is just looking at the history. Is there a previous history of intimate partner violence? But again, be aware, most intimate partner violence offenders do not go on and commit homicide. Within that relationship, are there verbal threats that male partner is going to kill the female? Are there actual documented threats? That's a risk factor. Is there forced sex within that relationship? Another big risk factor. We spoke about strangulation. There's several studies that talk about non-fatal strangulation is a major accelerant and risk factor. And if your audience is interested, Google my name, type in traumatic brain injury and strangulation. I wrote an article on the national level for that a few years ago. Are there any histories of previous threats with a weapon as well? Being aware of weapon access, as we spoke about before. If there is abuse going on during pregnancy, there's a full line of literature on intimate partner homicide among pregnant females. So that's another variable to take into account. Is there stalking going on within that relationship? So looking at stalking histories, big thing. Is there a relationship breakdown where the female is now leaving the partner? Is it a high conflict divorce situation? And is there drug and alcohol issues within that family system? So those are a few things to think about. There's a really good article that was published back in 2020. I think it's titled Risk Factors for Male Perpetration and Female Victimization of Intimate Partner Homicide. And it was a meta-analysis, really nice article published in the Journal of Trauma, Violence, and Abuse. In that meta-analysis, what they found were, I believe, 6 of the strongest risk factors for intimate partner homicide cases. It's going to overlap with what I said before. But that meta-analysis found, did that perpetrator have direct access to a firearm? Was there a documented previous history of non-fatal strangulation? Was there a previous history of raping the victim in that case? Is there a documented long-standing pattern of the perpetrator engaging in controlling behavior of that victim? And is there history of previous threats of harm to that victim? So those were some of the strongest risk factors for intimate partner homicide in that particular meta-analysis. Joe, before I move on to familicide, any thoughts on that you want me to go deeper into?
Well, as I listen to these risk factors, Jerrod, again, I like to put myself at times in the role of the practitioner. Can you talk maybe about are there, obviously there's risk assessments around this, but if a practitioner is seeing these, whether officially through a risk assessment or not, what type of approaches are there, or interventions? Or I know practitioners who supervise these types of domestic violence cases grapple with that balance, of course, between public safety and rehabilitation. But I know that's a tricky line to walk. So, like I said, before it gets to that level, what would you recommend as far as approaches to take, or interventions, or best practices?
Take the cases seriously, even though you may think, well, I've heard this, it's been a long-standing pattern in this situation for years. Take it serious. In an ideal world, there'd be a multidisciplinary team where you can consult with other professionals, you can refer out. It's very tricky in these situations, no doubt about it. So in some of these cases, there could be a huge driver because of shame and trauma and head injuries. Maybe there's food insecurity going on. Maybe there's high levels of shame. Maybe there's cultural factors to take into account. All kinds of variables. But the key is, obviously, we want to do everything in our power to prevent these cases. Referring out to maybe drug and alcohol providers, the mental health providers, working collaboratively with medical providers. We can do all the right things too. And in some cases, we may not be able to necessarily prevent all of these cases from happening, because think about some of the high profile cases we've seen in the media. What do you see after these happen? Well, they interview the neighbors in some cases, and what do the neighbors say? Well, this is the most nicest family in the whole world. I didn't see anything. So in some of these cases, you may not see any red flag indicators, but I would like to think there's always red flag indicators in these cases if we dig deep enough and we really know the nuances of this research. I think other interventions, in my opinion, is really staying current on this research, seeking out training and hiring consultants, becoming trauma informed, becoming informed on all these different kinds of interventions and models can be very helpful as well, because first line interventions, in my opinion, is really knowing what the research says and being aware of these risk factors, because if you're never aware of them, you're probably never looking for them, and it might not even be on your radar. And if you work with a really complex family, be okay to say, hey, I may not have the skill set or expertise. I got to pull in other people here. I need help here. That's okay. That team approach is very, very, very helpful. I'll go deeper into that, Joe, because I'll talk about this maybe within the context of familicide and see if there's anything in here that jumps out at you from your lens. But I'm going to talk mainly about familicide and family annihilators today. But familicide are the ones a lot of times you'll see in the media. It's a type of mass murder. Typically, it's one family member who murders multiple members of their own family. It's usually the male murdering the spouse and a child, and sometimes involving a pet. They're very, very traumatic crimes. Obviously, they're complex. They're poorly understood. These types of crimes receive a ton of media attention. The definitions can be somewhat inconsistent in the research literature, but it's an area that is understudied. And if you are a student or a researcher, ample room for more research, without a doubt. If you were to go through the familicide literature, and if you were to look at a number of different case studies, what are some of the common variables that seem to pop up along the way? And again, every case is absolutely different. But if you look at this in its totality, what do we see? Psychological instability in the perpetrator, which could be depression. Physical health issues could be a factor. Histories of violent behavior, risk-taking behavior, so looking for more impulsive control patterns of behavior. Rumination is more common in some of these offenders, where that person just ruminates and thinks on something and it grows and grows and grows. Divorce and the threat of divorce is a triggering event in a lot of these cases, where mom says, I'm leaving. And that could be that moment that sparks this and sends it over the edge. Paranoia could be more common in these offenders. High levels of jealousy in these offenders. They're motivated by their own humiliation. Maybe they're humiliated. Maybe there's high levels of shame. The perpetrator in some of these cases may suspect infidelity that may or may not be occurring. These offenders a lot of times have possessive tendencies, histories of self-destructive and rage control behaviors. Another triggering event could be a loss of a job for that offender. There is a couple case studies that talk about head trauma being maybe a driver. There's very little empirical-based literature on that within the context of familicide offenders. Possible personality disorder traits, even looking at the dark personality triad or the tetrad, so like narcissistic personality disorder, psychopathy, moral reasoning deficits, again, substance misuse, histories of attempted suicide. Some of these cases, you will find patterns of pathological gambling and a lot of financial problems. We talked about divorce, but even separation or going through high conflict custody disputes where that father thinks he's going to be losing his child. High levels of shame, social decline. So maybe that father had a really good standing in the community at one point, but they started to decline. And now their reputation is being threatened. Or there's a lack of sense of belonging. There's a couple studies that talk about early childhood trauma being a factor. I know there's cases, I'm not going to name any just out of respect for the survivors, but there's a few high-profile cases that we all probably have seen in the media where the perpetrator of this did this out of revenge to the wife, to get back at the wife, and they ended up killing the wife and the children as a result of revenge. So these are rare cases. There's some statistics that true familicide occurs anywhere between 1 to 2 times out of every 10 million people. This is familicide. This is kind of the most extreme end of the spectrum of family annihilators. But those are a few things to think about, Joe. Anything, Joe, that jumps out at you or anything you want to comment on? Or
I just wanted to comment before we get too far afoot, my last question that you responded to. And I loved as part of your answer when you said, essentially foundationally, it starts with just the practitioner having an awareness and being informed. That's the foundational start. And then we can go down these sort of specialty areas and stuff. But yeah, just being aware and informed, I think is an awesome place to start.
So to recap, so a couple other things you want to think about with familicide offenders, according to the research. Again, every case is different. More research is needed. But a lot of these offenders, if you look at their case history, have a long-standing history of failure and high levels of frustration. If you look at the literature on high levels of frustration, and that happens to a person over and over and over again over a long period of time, that can chip away at their ability to cope. So if that happens over a long period of time, their coping skills may be terrible. And then in this literature, it even talks about even the slightest disappointments to these offenders seem catastrophic, where to you and I, Joe, maybe we're disappointed something doesn't go our way. We can get over it. Maybe we got to go for a walk, talk to a friend, those kind of things. To these offenders, that even modest disappointment in their mind seems so catastrophic, they ruminate on it for day after day after day, and they have poor coping skills. Could be another variable to take into account. There's some interesting research too, Joe, that that talks, when we look specifically at familicide offenders, a high percentage of these incidents take place in homes that are located in middle-class suburban communities. Something to think about. Every case is different, of course. There is some research that's been published on this. And I believe it came from an article in 2021, Familicide, a Systematic Literature Review. And this literature review found that the mean age of these offenders were between 35 and 43. This literature review also found that higher levels of mental health problems were common in the histories of these offenders, including more psychosis, more paranoia, more personality disorders, depression, substance use problems, and obsessive kinds of behavior. Some studies, and it varies depending on the study you look at, but I've seen statistics range from 39 to 92% of these kinds of cases have histories of domestic violence in them. I suspect the majority of these cases probably have domestic violence in their history, but a lot of times they're never reported and it's hidden. So nobody truly knows what's going on. If you are ever working a case and it's a murder-suicide case where one family member murders the other family member and then ends up committing suicide, psychological instability is very, very common in those cases. Loss of family and friends, employment problems, social reputation issues, the list goes on. A couple articles on this too, Joe. This might be interesting in case any of you are working with older populations. Not a lot on older populations, but if you're ever working on an intimate partner homicide suicide case involving like an elderly individual, which is rare, but it does happen. The research says most of these cases are going to be the male committing the crime. The male oftentimes is in a caregiver role, or maybe the female partner who's older needs around-the-clock care. A lot of health issues going on. Maybe there's a lot of legal issues within that family, depression, access to firearms as well. So again, very different dimensions of these kinds of offenders. So when we think about, as we get close to wrapping up and moving into family annihilators, which is very, very close to familicide, and there's an argument to be made, they're almost kind of the same. But in my opinion, as a person who studies this literature, does a lot of trainings on this, I would say family annihilators are kind of the most extreme end of the spectrum of the intra-familial homicide spectrum. Again, I don't want to minimize any of these other cases. They're all very tragic, devastating cases. But if any of you are really interested in the topic of family annihilators, there's very few empirical-based studies on this topic. In a lot of these cases, not all, the offender kills himself after the event or forces law enforcement to kill him. Not always, but a lot of these cases definitely does happen. If you look at some of the older literature, family annihilators fall under the umbrella of a mass murder typology. There's different dimensions of that. So when you study mass murder, if any of you are interested in that topic, you have many different dimensions. There is a religious kind of type of mass murder, and we all know those cases, Jim Jones, those kind of cases. There's the disgruntled citizen type of mass murder where that person targets people where they typically have a grievance with. So this is more somebody that's maybe really mad at coworkers and ends up going to their place of employment and fortunately murders a bunch of people. There's another type called the set and run killer. I can't remember his name. There's some documentaries on this. You remember the bombing at the Olympics several years ago, Joe?
Yeah,
I can't remember. I've seen the movies on that, but that's a set and run killer where maybe they put like a bomb and it's set to go off at a particular time, or there's anonymous poisoning of medicine or other public products. There's the psychotic mass killer. There's the youthful school shooter. There's a pseudo commando. So there's many different dimensions of mass murders. Family annihilators is one of the dimensions that fall under that umbrella. So everything I talked about with familicide, pretty much goes hand in hand with family annihilators, depending on what research study that you look at. But in a nutshell, family annihilators, unfortunately, a lot of times go in and unfortunately murder their whole family. Multiple kids, wife, sometimes a pet, sometimes loved ones. Sometimes it doesn't end with the murder of their family. They go to another location and end up murdering other people in some cases as well. But most of these cases, not all, if a family annihilator case happen, family breakdowns, divorce, rejection, separation, custody issues with children. The research on family annihilators also talks about the importance of truly understanding toxic masculinity. If you're not familiar with that term, toxic masculinity, just think of somebody with a male, typically a lot of power and control issues, coercive control over the victim. So the victim is isolated. The victim isn't allowed to have friends, isn't allowed to go to work. There's economic abuse. There's a high level of dominance. There's a high level of violent threats. There's a couple articles that go into the different subtypes of family annihilators. Like every one of these kind of perpetrators, you can break it down even further. So there's 4 subtypes of family annihilators people want to be aware of. There's a self-righteous type, the disappointed type, the paranoid type, the anomic type. And a lot of this is going to overlap, but if you look at the literature on this, there's different typologies for all of this. And there's some really interesting articles out there too that talk about what are the most common methods used in these cases to kill their family, unfortunately. And again, it's all over the map. There are cases where stabbings occurred, carbon monoxide poisoning, fire setting, shooting, pushing someone off a high cliff, drowning someone intentionally, and very, very sad cases. So, Joe, I know I'm throwing a ton at you and your audience, but before I wrap up and maybe kind of tie this together, any other thoughts, questions, anything I can do?
I just wanted to comment and then ask you, Jerrod, whenever you're on the show, you do a great job of, for lack of a better term, debunking a lot of myths or biases around certain offender typologies, and you've done a great job doing that again today. You mentioned the role of the media coverage of a lot of these cases, and it got me thinking. I mentioned the TIDES supervision model that my co-creator Nicole and I have developed, and one of the mantras that we often use in training is that behavior has a purpose. Behavior has a purpose, whether it's criminal, delinquent, ugly, horrific. In other words, we're always trying to push the practitioner to dig deeper, look beyond the behavior, and get to the root cause and realize behavior has a purpose. And that's really at the root of change, right? And I want to bring this back to you, Jerrod. As I said, most folks learn about these horrific crimes through high-profile cases in the media, but the media often sensationalizes it. So what do you wish the public understood better when it comes to the realities behind these family homicides, if that's even a question you could answer, or again, sort of shed light on and embrace the tenet Nicole and I have around, folks, remember, even horrific behaviors, but behavior has a purpose.
Every case is different. There's multiple typologies. There's multiple layers. So if we were to think about a few other variables that make this very challenging and complicated, is in some cases, these perpetrators kill their family to maintain their own image. You will see documentaries, movies on this, high-profile cases, without a doubt. In some cases, they're definitely motivated by appearance. In other cases, the perpetrator in their mind believes they're doing their family a favor by killing them to save them from embarrassment. That something maybe a huge embarrassment where the father lost their job and now they're financially ruined. So in that father's mind, he's going to go kill his whole family to save his family from embarrassment. obviously very dysfunctional and delusional, but in their mind, they may be doing that.
I just wanted to interject real quick, Jerrod, and clarify for the listener when I was really leaning into my behavior as a purpose. That's not the same as saying behavior is justified or behavior is rationalized. I'm just saying that within the sense of moving the field away from, we flash back a couple hundred years ago and it was, there was this horrific tragedy took place. That individual must have been possessed by the devil, or it was a full moon, or it was this or that. Again, that's what I'm getting at when I say behavior as a purpose. And in this case, it could be, that purpose is to deflect from childhood trauma or to deflect from, you mentioned catastrophizing, which is one of our telltale cognitive distortions, to deal with those cognitive distortions or whatnot. So, like I said, I just wanted to go on record, and I'm not saying it's justified, but just it's not simply the phase of the moon that's driving these behaviors. We got to get a handle on the root cause if we want to prevent further tragedies.
Absolutely. And I guess a couple other variables for us just to think about is most of these cases, it's involving a long-term relationship. So why do I point that out? I believe it's good, obviously not always be possible, but if it was a long-term relationship, these problems didn't start overnight. There were probably red flag indicators going on for a long period of time. Almost always, not always, but almost always, these cases, these perpetrators, it's premeditated. So it's not like they thought it up earlier that morning. They've usually been thinking about it, planning in their mind, or just thinking about it for a long period of time. A lot of these offenders are usually educated. Many of them, again, middle age in most cases, not always. Depression, paranoia, intoxication, or a combination of those factors are often at play. High levels of personality disorders, previous histories of trauma are very common as well. And we need to be aware, too, that impulse control problems are a factor, self-destructive behaviors, and in some cases, maybe it involved a cultural honor killing. You'll find some literature out there. You look at some of that literature. But again, every case is different, very complicated. What do we do about all this? I've thrown so much at you. We're all overwhelmed, including me. In an ideal world, I would encourage the field to take neurocriminology, behavioral neuroscience, looking at some of these other strategies, interventions, fields of study, and apply it to better understanding these cases. Do some research. Could some of these offenders be dealing with frontal lobe impairment, problems with their limbic system? Could they be dealing with blood sugar dysregulation? Could there be food insecurity in some of these cases? Could there be all kinds of things that impact them at a biochemical level as well, where that could open up the door maybe to some biochemical interventions, or looking at it through a biopsychosocial model, looking at it through attachment theory, looking at it through the adverse childhood experiences research. Again, every case is different. Not every case is going to have those variables, but the more we can apply some of these other holistic fields of study, I think would be a really interesting and hopefully good thing for us to do, where it opens up the door to other earlier interventions, red flag indicators, and the more clinicians and healthcare providers and criminal justice forensic people can learn about all these things, we might be in a better position to prevent some of these cases. Again, we can do everything by the book. We can learn all these things. And unfortunately, I'm just being real. There's probably going to be some cases where we might not be able to prevent because we will never be able to get inside the brains of these people or inside that family system to truly see what's going on. But hopefully in some cases, we can and pick up some of these really subtle red flag indicators years before these crimes actually happen and implement strategies to really help avoid these things from happening in the future.
Jerrod, you've mentioned neurocriminology at least a couple of times. And for the record, I was not going to allow you to escape this interview without giving a shout out to your amazing becoming a neurocriminology informed professional that you constructed and that I am indeed a graduate of. I tell individuals, Jerrod, that after retiring from my government job in probation and parole after nearly 40 years, I can't believe I was not empowered with that knowledge early in my career, because it would have been a game changer. I think it is just amazing the possibilities around this field of study and how we can apply it to our field. So yes, as noted, give a shout out to that amazing program. I will also leave links for registration if folks want to learn more in the description of this podcast. But yeah, tell everybody about that great program and how you think folks can apply it to a variety of vocations.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I wish every criminal justice program, every legal, every forensic program at least had a class on neurocriminology, because just in my opinion, I may be wrong on this, but in my opinion, that should be the future of the criminal justice system. It takes criminology research and then it ties in neuroscience, some biochemistry, some nutrition, some genetics, some physiological factors. And if you can understand at least the basics of those things, you will have a much better understanding of how and why your clients' brains and bodies do what they do and what we can do to support and implement appropriate strategies. And we offer a online certification through the American Institute for the Advancement of Forensic Studies. And I think it's 42 hours and 14 different modules. And there's modules on all kinds of topics, including alexithymia, the HPA axis, nervous system dysfunction, prenatal factors, and all of these things that are so, so important. And I just say, think once, applying this practically. And I know this is a far off shot, but what would happen if the prison systems in the United States and around the world would start serving very healthy food? Maybe food that's under the umbrella of the Mediterranean diet, and getting rid of all the processed foods and all the things loaded with not so good things. And they're offering more health classes and more exercise, and we're really promoting gut health and reducing inflammation and aligning circadian rhythms. I think it would absolutely dramatically change the health and well-being of those individuals in those facilities. And then when they're getting ready to leave those facilities, their brains and bodies will work better, and they will be in a much better position to be more successful in the community. And if you don't believe me on that, shoot me an email. I have countless research studies that really support what I said there too. There's so much empirical-based literature on these topics, but also often these research studies really are not incorporated into curriculums, training programs, which I think they should be, in my opinion. So that's why we developed that certification program as well.
You gave me a nice affirmation at the beginning of this interview, Jerrod, and referred to me as an expert in the risk-need responsivity framework. And as you were just speaking, I was reflecting on that framework. And if listeners think about those three recognizable principles of R&R framework, obviously those of risk, need, and responsivity, the definition of responsivity is essentially use cognitive behavioral interventions to address those risk factors. Well, as you just pointed out, we're asking an entire field of practitioners to base their practice, their models, their approaches, and essentially, and I tell this to folks literally around the planet when I train and consult, practitioner, if there's one thing you can do to reduce harm, to get your clients to succeed, is get that individual to comprehend and understand and appreciate the thought-behavior link. This is in the R&R framework, at least, right? just getting them to understand our thoughts control our behaviors. Our thoughts control our behaviors. So we've, again, sort of tasked an entire vocation with this, but at the same time saying, but we're not going to give you any training or education around how the brain works, right? We keep throwing around that word cognitive in corrections, right? Cognitive behavioral interventions and this and that. Well, you need to know a little bit about the human brain to appreciate that. And then when we discover, as my colleague Nicole and I have, that, gee, I wonder why, even though I go by the playbook, I'm doing it as I was trained to do, these cost benefits analysis, these problem solving activities, why are these falling flat with my clients day after day, week after week, year after year? I'm just not getting the results. Well, it's a lot of the things we've talked about, Jerrod, or that I learned in your neurocriminology course. Well, because because of chronic trauma, they're spending a lot of time down in the amygdala and don't have access to the prefrontal cortex, where you need to be to do abstract thinking, problem solving, connecting immediate behaviors with long-term results. You know, it's like training a whole profession on giving nutrition to kids at school, but they don't know anything about how food's prepared. That was a crude analogy, but you kind of know where I'm going here. It's like, oh my gosh, it's just amazing what we're asking folks to do without really understanding beneath the veneer what's at play with all of those cognitive interventions.
Love what you and Nicole are doing, and I'm very happy to hear it's really a holistic model. It's very multidisciplinary in form. So hopefully our field continues to move in that direction. I don't have all the answers. None of us do, but the more we can collaborate with different providers that have different lenses that complement one another, it's only going to enhance the good work all of you are doing and hopefully lead to better client outcomes as well.
Yeah, again, I'm back to that word holistic, Jerrod. I think the good news is those of us in our various fields, whether they're corrections, addiction, mental health, you just mentioned nutrition, we've done a great job at really sort of perfecting our little individual piece of the pie, but now we're realizing it's the whole pie, right? We've got to get on the same page here for the sake of our clients and our other stakeholders.
Keep doing what you're doing. I think it's phenomenal. And any other thoughts, anything you want me to cover with this important, complex, and dark topic, unfortunately?
No, you did a great job here, Jerrod, as you always do, of sort of demystifying some of these horrific crimes that the vast, vast majority of individuals only see when it's a tragic, high-profile case, and then they form opinions and make decisions based on those biases. So, like we said earlier, I think the key is, and you do a great job of this, is just it all starts with an awareness and being informed and making evidence-based decisions with these very complex cases.
Thank you, Joe. And I'll just plant the seed with you. If this is something your audience has found helpful, a good follow-up might be kind of a part 2 from a intimate partner homicide lens, all about risk assessment, prevention, and intervention. So now this one, we have a good understanding of warning signs, some of the terms, statistics, the profiles. We take that to part 2. What can we do to prevent these crimes? What can we do to accurately assess and screen for? It's easier said than done, obviously, but there's a lot of screening tools out there for domestic violence in general. Definitely, there's other things to consider.
I'm going to hold you to that, Jerrod, because like I said, a lot of times we do a good job of wetting the whistle of the listener, but as I like to say, sometimes I put myself in their shoes and say, okay, this was great. This was fascinating. I was intrigued and agreed with everything Joe and Jerrod said, but how can I take theory and put it into practice when I get to work on Monday morning and I'm dealing with my caseload? So yeah, would love to do a follow-up on some of those more sort of practical things that the practitioner may do to augment their practices.
Thank you, Joe. Feel free to share my email with folks if they have questions, looking for any supplemental articles, or they want some links to those actual studies that I referenced in today's talk. I'm more than happy to share them with you.
Thank you so much, Jerrod. Jerrod Brown, Dr. Jerrod Brown from Concordia University, frequent guest of the show. We appreciate you coming back, Jerrod, and I look forward to part 2 of this amazing interview. We'll see you soon, my friend.
Thank you, my good friend. I appreciate you.
Thank you once again for tuning into the Criminologist Podcast. I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to Dr. Jerrod Brown for lending his time and expertise to this crucial and often emotionally charged topic. His work continues to deepen our understanding of complex human behavior, especially when it occurs within the walls of one's own home. As promised, I've included several valuable resources in the show notes of this episode. You will find Dr. Brown's recent quote featured in People magazine's A Killer in the Family Special Edition. Full link to that article is included, along with an excellent foundational article published by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, exploring definitions and categories of intra-familial homicide. A lot of the terminology you'll recognize from this interview. That link is available as well. And of course, if you're interested in taking your knowledge even deeper, please consider enrolling in Dr. Brown's certificate program around becoming a neurocriminology-informed professional. That link is included as well. And if you'd like to connect with Dr. Brown directly, whether to ask a question or explore training opportunities, he's graciously made himself available via email. That's included in the show notes as well. Of course, this is not Jerrod's first appearance on The Criminologist. Be sure to check out his earlier episodes on topics such as autism spectrum disorder, executive functioning, trauma, and much, much more. Just search his name in our archives and enjoy the full library of insights. Hey, finally, a very special shout out to my new friends and listeners in Uruguay. I just returned from 2 weeks of training their National Corrections Agency, the Instituto Nacional de Rehabilitación, or INR, on the risk-need-responsivity model. It was an absolute honor to collaborate on strengthening the risk-needs-responsivity model and evidence-based practices across borders. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us. Let's broaden that aperture. Let's bring in some more things. As you have done, Jerrod, I would contend my partner, Nicole Kimberly Staley, and I have done that with our TIDES model, where we're looking at some of these other variables around trauma, around neuroscience, and not just those pathways into crime, the risk needs responsivity framework, but those pathways out of crime and delinquency, the desistance framework. But again, it's all about getting a bigger picture of the client. It's almost as if we've tasked professionals with solving a puzzle, but we're not giving them all the pieces of the puzzle.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, training opportunities, program design, or interview requests, visit theparagongroup.llc.com. To learn more about the TIDES supervision model, a trauma-informed, desistance-based approach to community supervision, please visit the TIDESLLC.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out the Criminologist YouTube channel for additional content, including exclusive video interviews and international insights. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star review. And as always, thank you for listening.